Tonight, we are looking at something Vladimir Putin has spent more than 2 decades telling the world could never happen. Something his entire political brand is built on preventing. Inside the Russian state, inside the Russian military machine that he has purged and rebuilt and terrorized into obedience, there is suddenly something he cannot quite control: resistance. Not from the streets of Moscow, not from teenagers posting anti-war slogans on social media, but from within the ranks of the people whose job is to carry out his war. And tonight, senior U.S. officials are describing what they're seeing as a serious red flag, not just about the war in Ukraine, but about the stability and predictability of the Russian state itself. Good evening. What we are watching right now in real time is a story that runs straight against the image Vladimir Putin has always tried to project. The image of a man whose security services know everything, whose generals fall into line, whose war machine may be brutal and clumsy, but is never disobedient. That image has taken body blow after body blow over the last 3 years. The armed mutiny by Wagner in 2023 that seized a Russian city and drove a column of mercenaries toward Moscow. The ouster of his longtime defense minister amid corruption scandals and battlefield failures. The reports of Russian soldiers being tortured or executed by their own commanders for refusing suicidal orders. And now, this week, something even more politically dangerous for Putin. Respected figures from within the Russian military establishment, people who wore the uniform, commanded the troops, and benefited from this system for years, openly challenging the way this war is being fought, and by extension, the man who ordered it. In Moscow, that's not just a policy debate. Under Russian law, that kind of criticism can land you in prison. It has already landed thousands of ordinary Russians in courtrooms and jail cells. But a former commander of Russia's ground forces has now given an interview in which he calmly explains that the invasion of Ukraine was built on lies, that the intelligence underpinning it was disastrously wrong, and that the military leadership pretended for months that everything was going according to plan, when, in reality, the supposedly unstoppable Russian advance had collapsed. He talks about the original plan, the fabled 3-day push to Kyiv, as a fantasy constructed on false polling numbers and wishful thinking. He essentially says, the system lied to itself and the soldiers paid the price. You do not say that in public in today's Russia unless you are either reckless, desperate, or you believe there is a bigger audience for your message than just the interviewer and the censor. You do not say that unless you are trying in some way to speak to people inside the institution you came from, the officer corps, the colonels and the majors and the brigade commanders who have been ordered again and again to throw untrained conscripts and prison recruits into fortified Ukrainian positions and to keep going no matter how many bodies come back. And that is what U.S. officials are staring at tonight. They are not just seeing one retired general mouthing off. They are reading it alongside months of intelligence about morale, about discipline, about the way the Russian military has been forced to keep this war going. The picture that emerges is grim. Independent investigations, and the kind that still happen outside Russia's borders, even if they're banned inside, describe Russian commanders executing or deliberately sacrificing their own soldiers when they refuse to attack. Field units holding ad hoc punishment pits, where men who say no to orders are beaten, starved, or sent straight to the most dangerous parts of the front as cannon fodder. The Guardian, that is not the portrait of a confident army. That is the portrait of a leadership terrified of its own troops, propping up obedience with terror because respect and belief in the mission have long since run out. At the same time, even pro-Kremlin military analysts, the television generals, the think tankers who usually repeat the party line, have begun admitting on Russian platforms that the war is not going the way they promised. They acknowledge, often in coded language, that Ukraine's economy has not collapsed, that Western aid has not evaporated, that Russian losses are enormous, and that the country is straining to keep up the material and political cost of what the Kremlin still insists on calling a special military operation. For a regime that survives on the careful manufacturing of reality, those little cracks in the story matter. Now lay on top of that the battlefield facts. In eastern Ukraine, the Russian military has spent nearly 2 years grinding its way toward the fortress city of Pokrovsk, at stunning cost. Western assessments say Russia has lost tens of thousands of troops and thousands of armored vehicles over a relatively small stretch of ground. Ukraine insists that, yes, Russia has taken some territory, but at a cost so lopsided that it amounts to bleeding its own army to achieve political talking points. Ukraine's president and his top commander have publicly argued that Russia's big offensives in 2025 failed to meet their strategic goals and that Russian advances are coming at a catastrophic price in lives and equipment. At sea, Russia has been forced to pull much of its Black Sea fleet back toward its ports, hugging the coast and firing missiles from a distance because Ukrainian sea drones have made open water operations too dangerous. In other words, whatever Moscow says about inevitable victory, the officers on the ground and the sailors in the fleet can see with their own eyes that the war is not the great triumphant march they were promised. They are fighting, bleeding, and dying in a campaign that looks, from their perspective, like an endless treadmill. That's the context in which this new wave of internal resistance matters. Intelligence officials in Washington and European capitals say they have been watching for signs that the strain on the Russian military might start to show up not just in desertions and draft dodging, but in behavior by the officer corps, refusals to carry out especially reckless orders, attempts to slow the pace of offensives, quiet complaints up the chain about ammunition, about casualties, about the lack of rotation for units that have been in the trenches for months on end. And the picture they see now, they say, is one in which those quiet signals are becoming louder. There are more reports of battalion commanders pushing back, of generals arguing with the Kremlin's political minders about what is militarily possible, of military bloggers who are very often close to serving officers, criticizing decisions they hint were made for television, not for victory. None of this means that a coup is around the corner. This is not 1917, with soldiers Soviets forming in the trenches and Tsarist officers being thrown into rivers. But to U.S. officials, what it does mean is that a pillar of Putin's personal power, the idea that he can command the loyalty and compliance of the people with guns, is under more pressure than at any time since the Wagner mutiny briefly seized a major Russian city and drove toward Moscow. That mutiny ended after one long day, with its leader dead in a suspicious plane crash 2 months later. But it left behind a scar. Inside the Pentagon, analysts still talk about those hours when Russia's own military units stood aside and watched as thousands of mercenaries rolled toward the capital. They remember that as the moment when, for the first time, it became plausible to imagine someone with tanks refusing to follow the script the Kremlin had written for them. Since then, Putin has tried to reassert control through purges and reshuffles. He removed his longtime defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, a man who had stood with him through the annexation of Crimea and the early stages of the war, and replaced him with a technocrat, an economist with no uniform, in an effort to tie the war machine more tightly to Russia's broader economy. He allowed corruption investigations to nibble at the edges of his own defense ministry, with a deputy minister arrested on bribery charges in what looked like both a warning shot and a distraction. He has tried to fold the remnants of Wagner into the formal state, taking over their businesses and their propaganda outlets. All of that was supposed to send a clear message. There is one commander-in-chief, one center of gravity. The days of freelance warlords are over. But here's the problem that American officials see. You can remove the individuals, you can redistribute the money, you can arrest a few scapegoats for corruption. What you cannot easily repair is the basic trust between the men giving the orders and the men expected to die carrying them out. When a former top general goes on the record to say, in essence, we lied to ourselves about this war, we misled our own president, we completely misread Ukraine, that is not just a shot at some faceless intelligence officer in a basement. That is a shot at the system itself. And U.S. officials are taking note, because when a system starts to doubt itself, its behavior becomes harder to predict. Inside Washington, this is not an academic discussion. The current administration, President Donald Trump back in the White House, has unveiled a new national security strategy that, in some surprising ways, sounds friendlier to Moscow on paper. It emphasizes avoiding direct confrontation with Russia, talks about reviving a Monroe Doctrine-style focus on the Western Hemisphere, and openly calls for a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin, in a very unusual twist, has publicly praised parts of that document. But even as the Trump White House tries to chart a path to de-escalation and strategic stability, the career officials, the people who read the intel cables and watch the satellite feeds, are flagging something else. A Russia whose leadership is nervous, whose conventional forces are under strain, and whose internal cohesion is showing cracks. In meetings at the Pentagon and the National Security Council, the phrase serious red flag has come up in 3 distinct contexts, according to people familiar with those discussions. First, the treatment of Russian soldiers who refuse to fight, the use of executions and deliberate suicide missions as a tool of discipline, is seen as a sign that basic command authority is eroding, not strengthening. You don't shoot your own men to keep them in line if you believe they still genuinely support the mission. Second, the public criticism from figures like that retired ground forces commander is interpreted as a test balloon. If the Kremlin lets it slide, it suggests it cannot afford to silence everyone. If it cracks down, it risks turning a grumbling officer corps into a fearful and resentful one. Either outcome is risky. And third, the broader Russian information environment, where pro-government analysts are quietly acknowledging problems, where military bloggers complain about incompetent tactics, where leaked documents suggest even the FSB is uneasy about some of Moscow's foreign entanglements, points to a system whose internal narrative is fraying. The U.S. has spent decades studying how authoritarian states look from the inside when they are under stress. The combination of battlefield attrition, economic strain from sanctions, and visible dissent among elites is not always a sign that collapse is imminent, but it is almost always a sign that decision-making becomes more erratic and more driven by short-term survival. For Ukraine, this internal Russian drama is both an opportunity and a danger. On the one hand, cracks in Russian unity between the Kremlin and the generals, between the commanders and the troops, make it harder for Moscow to sustain the kind of relentless, grinding offensives that have chewed up places like Avdiivka and Pokrovsk. They complicate Russian efforts to rotate units, to push fresh troops into the line, to maintain the illusion that victory is inevitable. On the other hand, a nervous Kremlin is a Kremlin that may feel pressure to show strength, to demonstrate that it still calls the shots. That can mean more missiles at Ukrainian cities, more pressure on the energy grid, more nuclear saber rattling aimed at scaring the West away from deeper support. For the United States and NATO, the question is how to respond to a Russia that is, at the same time, more brittle and more dangerous. The Trump administration has signaled that it wants to keep channels open with Moscow, that it sees some convergence of interest in avoiding all-out confrontation. There have been rare, high-level communications between U.S. and Russian military leaders over the last year, even as the war rages, precisely to avoid miscalculation. But tonight, as these new signs of internal resistance inside the Russian military become clearer, U.S. officials are also updating their risk assessments. They are asking, if Putin's control over his own war machine is not as absolute as he claims, what happens in a crisis? Who exactly is making decisions? And how confident can anyone be that everyone with their finger on a trigger will follow instructions in a predictable way? Those questions echo far beyond the Donbass. They touch on NATO's posture in Eastern Europe, on the alliance's decisions about missile defenses and forward deployments, on how much and what kind of military aid flows to Ukraine. They influence whether European leaders believe they are dealing with a rational, tightly controlled adversary or a more fragmented, factionalized system in which personal survival and intra-elite rivalries can matter as much as national strategy. Remember, the last time we saw open rebellion by armed men loyal to a Russian warlord, it happened with almost no warning. And for nearly 24 hours, the world had to contemplate the possibility that a nuclear-armed state might be entering some kind of internal power struggle. That's why what might look from a distance like just another retired general complaining about the past is being treated in Washington as a red flag. Because under an authoritarian system like Putin's, the line between past and present, between military analysis and political dissent, is thin. People do not talk like this unless they think something has changed in the air. Maybe they sense the Kremlin is weaker. Maybe they see a chance to influence the next phase of the war. Maybe they are hedging against a future in which they will have to explain to their fellow Russians or to a court what they did during these years. And so tonight, as we watch the latest wave of Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities, as we see the slow, bloody movement of front lines in places most of us had never heard of before this war, it is worth remembering that wars are not only decided by weapons and terrain. They are decided by institutions, by morale, by whether the people ordered to fight still believe in the authority of the people giving those orders. Inside Russia, cracks in that belief are widening. U.S. officials see that as a warning, a serious red flag that this war is entering a more volatile phase, in which the greatest danger may not come only from what Putin decides to do, but from what happens if the institutions beneath him decide they will no longer pay any price to keep him in power. For Ukraine, that means the fight goes on, with all its daily horror, but also with the knowledge that time may not be on Russia's side, in quite the way Moscow has been telling itself. For the United States and its allies, it means wrestling with an uncomfortable truth. A weaker, more internally conflicted Russia is not automatically a safer Russia. It may be a Russia that lashes out more often, that takes greater risks, that uses terror against its own soldiers and its neighbors alike to try to hold together a story that fewer and fewer people inside its own system believe. That is the reality confronting Western policymakers tonight. A Russian president facing resistance in places he has always assumed were his most loyal strongholds. A military establishment that is, for the first time in years, letting its doubts leak into public view. And an American government that has to decide how to respond to these signals, whether to ease pressure in the hope of coaxing Russia toward a settlement, or to keep backing Ukraine on the assumption that every day this war continues deepens the cracks inside the system that launched it. What we know, because history teaches it again and again, is that when powerful regimes start to fear their own militaries, when they start to rely more on coercion than consent within the ranks, when generals begin to talk more openly about past mistakes, the story is rarely over. It is usually changing shape. How it changes from here will depend on decisions made in Moscow, in Kyiv, and yes, in Washington. But tonight, the image of Vladimir Putin as the unchallengeable master of his own war is dimmer than it has been in a very long time. And that, in the words of those watching this most closely, is a serious red flag. Not just for the Kremlin, but for a world that has to live with whatever happens next.